Blades of grass and blood. Green blades of life surged from the greasy soil. The surface split as they impaled it from below. I laid flat on my back in the center of a tiny clearing. My ravished stomach choked my primal fear and molded it into something new. My dreary limbs were injected with an explosive fuel. I stood and sprinted. The green blades swooshed across my face and around my torso as I blindly flew through their delicate stems. There had to be food somewhere. My eyes widened as I came to a stop. I reached out my aching hands and tore one of the green plants in half. I forced my mouth open as I leaned towards the strip of the plant. I clenched my teeth through its flesh and ripped a piece free. I barely noticed as a scraping sensation tore across my teeth. The moment the piece of the plant slid atop my tongue, I felt jagged daggers splitting and sliding through my flesh. I spat the mangled leaf part onto the mud below, thin streams of blood flowing around it. I screamed out into the blades. My vision adopted a light red tint as adrenaline leaked through my veins once again. A tiny slit crawled across the back of my hand as it rubbed against one of the blades. Dots of blood lined my ravaging path through the fearsome plants. A flask of silver slid through my peripheral vision. Immediately rerouting, the top half of my right pant leg split off from itself. The blade detached from my leg, leaving it intact but bearing a massive hole. My sightline exploded as I entered a wide clearing. It was littered with the stems of blackened blades, each one giving off the faintest tinge of puffy gray smoke. The sharp scent of sparks tickled my nose as I shifted forward. In the center of the clearing, a glistening white sphere lay in a small crater. Arms of splattered mud slid down its smooth surface. As I walked around the sphere's perimeter, a circular hole carved into its side shifted into view. My muscles clenched and my body turned to ice. As my adrenaline cooled, more and more of my brain had space for hard logic. Unfortunately, with logic came white-hot fear. Fear that felt as if it would cause my skin to simultaneously explode and turn inside out, all at the same time. I recognized this fear as an escape capsule. It could have only been there if someone was inside it. If I had moved just inches forward, my face would be visible to whoever it was. One last desperate spike of adrenaline stabbed through my bones, attempting to convince me to run. I nearly gave in, but a weight was suddenly dropped on that urge. I was quite familiar with the contents of these capsules, and almost always they contained emergency supplies. I creeped backwards and gradually laid my unwounded hand on the nearest uncharred blade. My vision broke off from the hole in the capsule and I gazed across the blade's surface. On one side, it was smooth with a hint of moisture. I slid a finger down over it but felt no pain and detected no blood. I leaned over to view the blade's opposing side. It bore a darker hue, but tiny, springy white spears sprung out in all directions. I squinted as I attempted to inspect the smaller details of the spears. Their ends were impeccably thin. I lightly tapped the other side of the blade. It wafted back and forth for a moment, but each and every spear remained perfectly still, apparently less like wobbly string and more like sturdy steel. I tore a small piece of the plant off. This time I had no intention of consuming it. I creeped towards the capsule, bracing my arm to strike at any moment. I lurched forward, but found no one in the capsule. Instantly, the white-hot fear burned on the back of my neck. If no one was currently in the capsule, they could be anywhere outside. I found this realization to be strangely threatening. I rescanned the area with a newfound caution. Entering the capsule, I discovered a retractable bed alongside two cabinets. The first cabinet stored a bandage roll and a number of pills in little plastic bottles. I snatched up the bandage roll as if to take it, but a thought crossed my mind that convinced me to reassess that choice. I knew I would need both the bed and the shelter that the capsule provided. I had no idea how long I would be stuck in the Valley of the Blades. I figured I'd wait for someone to return and attempt to reason with them. If, for whatever reason, that wasn't an option, I'd be sure to keep the piece of the plant nearby. I searched the second cabinet and found 4 packs of rations. They were draped in white and transparent plastic. The plastic bore text exclaiming, "Dearth. Just one day, just one dearth." On the other side of the transparent plastic, a gray wrinkly prism attempted to wrinkle its way out of the packaging. My stomach growled and my cut hand ached at the same moment. I quivered. I knew if I were to take any of the supplies, reasoning could very well be off the table. Unfortunately, I could feel my last huffs of energy growing small and see the blood continue to pour out of my hand. I returned to the first cabinet and shot a glance outside, as if to catch someone silently watching me. I extracted the bandage roll and tore off a piece before applying it to my hand. I then slid one dirt bar out into the open and closed the cabinet. I whispered under my breath, 4 days. The sun drifted closer and closer to the horizon. Sometimes when I let my guard down, I'd glance up at it, but for only a moment, so as to not burn my eyes. It gave me a deep sense of familiarity, and yet I knew it could not be more different. It was only a little smaller. Whether that meant it was farther or actually smaller made no difference. The day only lasted about an hour longer than usual. I was at the time grateful for the extra light, but as twilight struck the blades, it dawned on me that the night would live on longer too. A shrill breeze swayed the blades as night crept across the land. Stars littered the sky, and yet they were lonely. Far off, the blades shifted, but it was just a little too much for me to convince myself it was the wind's doing. My breathing accelerated. I turned to a thin lever near the exit of the capsule and gazed up at a single light bulb surrounded by iron bars. The power to ward off the darkness lay at the edge of my fingertips. Of course, I knew that there could only be so much electricity stored, and anyway, darkness wasn't truly the problem. It was whatever hid in the darkness that directly transmitted shivers to my spine. For all I knew, turning on that light wouldn't ward off anything but my chance at survival. I reopened the second cabinet, and as I gazed at its shrunken contents, I whispered to myself, 3. My still damaged tongue ached, and my stomach growled. I knew it couldn't last, but going back very well may have been worse than starving. Perhaps no one was left. I couldn't quite decide if I hoped that to be the case. If he found me, if he got the drop on me, I'd be as good as dead. I shook violently as the sun rose over the field of blades. The previous night had been alive. Over and over again the blades rustled, but I could never catch anything moving. My eyelids grew heavy, but I couldn't afford to let them close. There was no telling what might have discovered me if I allowed sleep to take me hostage. Paintings I had never seen brushed across my vision, bearing no warning and no conclusion. My misfortune was such that at that point I had gone 2 nights without sleep. It seemed as if something new was after me on the daily, or you could say the nightly. I slithered out of the capsule to stretch my limbs. The sun radiated piercing warmth over my exposed skin. Said warmth sunk into my muscles and drank my life force. As my nerves cooled, I found an incessant pressure in my throat. It attempted to escape itself and shrink in on itself both at the same time. There was food, bandages, and even a compacted emergency lifeboat in the capsule, and yet there was no water to be found. I smashed my fist into the silvery steel of the capsule. A narrow strand of red slid down the valve's curved edge. My mind froze as I stared at the precious fluid escaping my possession. I traced my steps back through the blades. I had hit the ground minutes before it happened. I had seen it fall, though for some reason I had not felt it. I lifted my injured fist. I only had enough bandage left to reasonably cover one more cut. A hoot fell to the ground. I snapped my neck backwards to discover 2 birds flying above me. My trot was suspended as I inspected the birds more closely. I found that they were in fact exceptionally far above me. I dashed to the edge of the blades, careful not to make contact. Once I came to understand their size, I refused to believe my eyes. The hoot sounded again, this time louder. My heart sank as I peered upwards. Both birds dived headfirst towards me. I broke into a mad dash through the thin trail between the blades. My foot smashed into a thick clump of mud. I found my face inches into the ground. There was a thin rustling to my left. I let out a wail as I attempted to regain my balance. Both of my feet slashed and slipped through the mud, netting me no progress. I gradually turned over to find one of the birds standing above me. It stood taller than any man I had ever seen. It squealed and squawked as it raised its wings above me. It cranked its beak backwards before it lunged towards me like a murderer's knife. A roar shook the blades as a grotesquely muscular beast exploded onto the bird. Only a single thin stream of red flowed from the bird's neck, and yet it was instantly still. Its companion haphazardly attempted to fly from the scene. The beast merely turned its head towards it and snorted. As its gaze drifted to me, I found the beast to appear like a bear-sized tiger, with bulging veins and a single rapier-like tooth lodged in the center of its jaw. The beast's head curled to the side as it stared at me. Hundreds of much smaller razor-sharp fangs extended out as the beast plunged the bird down its throat. I felt a rising sensation in my neck as I watched the ruthless efficiency of the meal. I got to my feet, and the monstrous cat made no notice. I soon assumed it continued to ignore me as all of my limbs stayed intact as I sprinted. The creature had an unusual but natural calm to it. I almost felt safe with it. That being said, I didn't think twice before making my escape. Unfortunately, the encounter had burned much of my remaining energy. I found myself staring at the mud. It had to have water in it. If I couldn't find the source, I knew I'd have to take what I could get. My tongue withdrew into the back of my head as I stared at the murky puddle of brown water. My knees nearly collapsed on themselves as I trekked up a steep hill. The shaking in my limbs finally stopped, or at least, I no longer felt it. Above the hill's horizon, I spotted a tiny silver glint. I moved up and could soon see the entire top fin. Even further, some of the hull came into view. It all shone silver, just like I remembered. My foot hit stable ground, and I expected to see the vessel laying desecrated in a crater. Though I wasn't too thrilled about that prospect, what I ended up finding absolutely stunned me. The entire gleaming ship lay nose first in a vast blue lake. I assumed it was a lake, though I could not see the opposite end, only what appeared to be giant mountains far across the water. Enormous tremors ran across the ship's plating. Not a single light shone through its thousands of windows. At least half of its surface was deep under the water. A ginormous fuel tank mounted below the ship leaked a waterfall of black liquid into the lake. Putting significantly less effort into inspecting the water than I had the ship, I dropped my mouth into the liquid. Drawing my head away, a tinge of anxiety ran through my heavy stomach. I realized there may not have been any room left for food. At least, I found it safe to assume it was a lake, as there was no trace of salt. But then again, I couldn't know for sure. I gazed once more at the drowning giant. I suspected its contents had the potential to vastly improve my chances of survival. I shifted away from the water. The combination of the massive lake and the colossal ship dripped steaming fear down my eyelids. I creeped onto the bed and almost immediately had to fight to stay conscious. It had been proven to me that there was danger to be found in the blades. Despite that, I felt almost protected. I knew the beast may have acted differently if it were hungrier or the bird were smaller. Despite that, I felt a foreign kinship with it. It had chosen to let me live. As my eyelids closed, I clinged on to the waking world for just another moment. The ship flashed across my vision. Not the image of it half sunken in the lake, but long before then, just before I first boarded. I'd gazed upon it then with simultaneous terror and excitement. I knew taking it was a great risk far earlier than I had any suspicion it could crash. The version of the ship I had seen that day only sparked one sensation in my chest: pure awe. I sat up in my bed, but it was not the one I had found sleeping. My cabin extended out around me, aesthetic wooden walls hidden behind feet of solid steel plating. I knew the shape and the furniture of the room were identical to that of every single other on board. My cabin had one difference, however. One divergent object lay within it. At the foot of my bed, a chair stood facing me. The chair was not what was unique. All the other cabins had this chair too, except theirs were attached to the table to the left of my bed. My table was alone. On the chair, a brownish yellow wooden crate sat precariously at its edge. A tiny nudge in the wrong direction, and the crash would be disastrous. I crawled toward it. I laid my hand upon its planks. Tiny movements emanated from inside. I sighed and pushed the crate away into a safer position atop the chair. I'll be back. I stumbled out of bed and was changed within moments. My mind still a blur, I wafted the door open and peered at my new surroundings. A grand dining hall lay in front of me. Tables stretched across the colossal room. Its floor was perfectly clean white, and its ceiling was equally dotted in divinely bright lighting. My nose was drenched in the delectable scent of fine donuts, a delicacy I had only had the privilege of partaking in that very room. 2, 1, 0. And my stomach remembered how to growl. All I had to show for my time survived was a circular tarp made from the blades. I plastered wet mud around its edges and used it to seal myself inside my new home. The prickly side of the blade corpse poked towards the outside world, while the smooth side graced my room. Nothing bothered me for 2 days. When I awoke on the third, I found no rations and no water, either in the capsule or in my stomach. I begrudgingly tore a hole in my precarious tarp. The light of the new sun beamed onto my face. I could easily get water, as long as I could survive the journey to the lake. But food was a complete unknown. I remembered the vast dining hall of the ship. Surely some of it had survived the crash in edible condition. But what if he's gone back? His rations had to have run out yesterday. He could be waiting for me inside, I said aloud. I visualized the colossal expanse of the ship. I figured that even if he was inside it somewhere, we would probably never see each other. Of course, probably wasn't a perfect probability. My guts didn't shake at the thought of him because he was some monster like the huge birds or the grotesque tiger. He was just a man, and any man can see things. Any man can remember things, and any man can tell another what he has witnessed. I had to choose my fear of him or my fear of starving. I extracted the compacted emergency lifeboat from a hatch holding it to the wall. It wasn't much of a lifeboat yet. Rather, it was a little yellow square that would have exploded into something much greater if not for the tight rope that arched around its geometry. I reached back into the capsule and snatched up a green mass. I wielded a dagger I had crafted in my solitude. Though it had no real cutting edge, it was covered in the tiny white spears of the blades. I hadn't made the weapon to fight any of the creatures I had so far encountered. I figured that due to their size, a few cuts wouldn't be enough to save me from anything. I made the weapon as insurance in case someone else discovered me. I stayed watchful throughout my entire journey back to the lake, as if seeing a beast early could stop it from devouring me. On the lake bed, I unstrapped the rope around the compact lifeboat. A limp blanket of yellow fell to the grainy sand. It still didn't quite resemble the lifeboat I was looking for. I grazed my hand across its dry plastic edges until I tapped an intruding form. I discovered a transparent plug lodged inside the blanket. I ripped it from the lifeboat and lowered my lips to the black hole it left behind. I bounced the newly inflated lifeboat into the water. As I stepped inside, the lake ripples swirled around my bare ankles. A cold sting pierced my skin, but was not unwelcome. I dropped a cupped hand into the water and extracted some. I realized if I couldn't find water in the ship, I'd have to be back numerous times. I compared the lifeboat's yellow plastic to the fine edges of the spears on my dagger. Considering how easily they had torn through my flesh previously, I wasn't about to risk a puncture in the boat. I approached the line of blades and placed the dagger just out of sight. I hopped into the gleaming yellow lifeboat. I sighed as I came to understand my complete lack of an oar. I plunged my arms into the chilled water and rowed with all my might. It was a sluggish process, but I was sure the ship was growing larger. I lowered my lips to the water as the lifeboat bumped into the ships. Strings of strain flowed through my muscles. I reaped a huge drink and stared up at the ship ahead of me. I scanned its edge and found no entry point. My stomach growled like a dying monster. I stared forward as red heat flowed through my veins. A tall window stood engraved in the wall in front of me. The room behind it completely clouded in darkness. I let out a wail as my fist bounced off the glass. Not even a crack was generated. My fist, however, leaked blood and pain in tandem. I fell back into the lifeboat. The treasures of the ship stowed away right in front of me. There was a tap on the window. It seemed to echo for a lifetime. My eyes opened wide and I inhaled reflexively. Laying down on the boat, I knew I'd be invisible to anyone on the inside, but I wondered if it would be worth revealing myself. I may have been able to gain access to the ship. My stomach growled so loud I wondered if it was possible to hear it on the other side of the glass. I slowly lifted my torso. The glass slid upwards with a screech. A balding man with a long, mangled gray beard extended his head out of the window. His dark brow furrowed as he said, "If you're looking for someone, you won't find 'em." He spoke like a farm man, an accent I had never heard in person before. I sat motionless for a moment before asking, "What do you mean?" "I mean the dead. Every last one of them. Besides me, of course." I sighed. I hadn't considered how many people had survived the crash, but I definitely wouldn't have assumed only one. "Do you have access to any of the food?" The man's head slipped back a couple inches, and the distance between his eyelids shrunk. His pupils jumped down to my lifeboat and back to me. "Depends. Would you be opposed to me taking a ferry ride back to land in that there boat?" I exhaled softly through my nose in relief. It was barely a price to pay for food. "I don't see why not." The hulls of the ship slanted down into a steep angle. Fortunately, there were rails against all the walls, built for turbulence. They couldn't have done much for anyone during the crash. If I were to let go of said rails, I'd likely find myself sliding uncontrollably until I hit the water. When the man had first let me into the ship, we were in a half-flooded bedroom. Every adjacent room was flooded to the exact same degree. The water level inside seemed to only be a few inches below the one outside. As we climbed, we entered a huge room lined with tables and benches. Food and plates littered the walls, but there was a strange lack of human touch. I squinted my eyes, asking, "Where are all the people?" The ship was packed from head to toe. It should be a tragedy in here. The man groaned and waved his hand. "The great mysteries of life, right?" I climbed the tables and benches with a little bit of distance from the man. At what was once the room's highest point, I knew there would be a set of double doors that led to the kitchen. At least that's where the employees would come from with our food. I wrapped my hand around the slanted doorknob of one of the double doors, but I didn't twist it. I winded my head around back towards the hallway we had come from. Opposing the dining room, 10 or so suite doors were visible. My eyes glued themselves to the one near the center. "We don't got all day." "Yeah, of course. Just making sure there's an easy path back." 10 minutes later, my pockets were stuffed with candy bars and bright wrappers. The kitchen had been lined with refrigerators and freezers, but almost all of that would be rotten soon if it wasn't already. I relied heavily on the sugary treats stacked on the shelves. It didn't seem like that stuff could go bad. The man cleared his throat. "What you've got should be good for 4 days." I sighed. I was right back on the same timer. We slid from table to table as we neared the hallway. Once we reached the wall, slanted downwards at the other end of the room, we used it to hobble the rest of the way. The man grappled himself to the rails and started downwards. I leaped to the other side of the hall and wrapped my arms around the railing. The man didn't seem to notice. I climbed upwards. I pulled the steel rail back and forth between my arms as I lurched across it. Just as I reached out my hand to open the door to my old suite, the man shouted, "What are you doing up there?" I just thought there might be supplies in the suites." The man pursed his lips as he replied, "If you really need supplies, go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you." I slowly clicked my tongue with narrowed eyes as I slid the door open. Stepping inside, a gasp escaped my mouth. Grayed corpses piled everywhere in the slanted suite. A vile stench ripped its way through my nostrils, causing me to nearly trip. I coughed into the horrid air. "Why are they here? Did that strange man do this?" The man had warned me. I couldn't wrap my head around why someone or something would go through all the effort of moving those wretched bodies. I grit my teeth and stepped over a pile of at least 5. Besides the corpse atop the pile, I couldn't tell whose limbs were whose. I decided I didn't need to know. I scanned the rest of the room, ignoring the various elephants scattered among it. Amidst the bodies, the crate lay against the floor, or the wall. They were no longer so different. I knew I still had a chance to salvage everything. I could return to my life before. I just needed that crate. I reached forward. My arm froze. Even if someone did come for me, surely they would want to know what was inside it. Surely if they did, I would have been better off being any of the bodies lying at my feet. The crate twitched and shifted. I had to know if it was still possible. If I could actually make good on my word. Of course, the entire bargain would be impossible to complete, but my life may have been spared at the very least. I started to reach towards the crate, but my arms froze again alongside the entire rest of my body. My skin crawled as if it feared being detached from my bones. They haven't eaten in days. They can't possibly cause any harm yet. I reassured myself. I gradually lifted the crate's wooden lid. Light shone through the thin line between wood. In each of the two separate compartments, splitting the crate in half, a tiny set of eyes opened. For a brief moment there was silence. It was as if the entire foreign planet had come to a stop. Vicious squawking blasted off the walls of the suite as a pair of sparkly black birds exploded from inside the crate. Their bodies were shaped like that of a crow, but their mannerisms showed no trace of anguish or fear. The birds darted in circles around me. Their black feathers reflected the sun from the slanted window into my eyes. A screeching pain slid across my shoulder. I touched it with my hand and found it dripping in crimson. I dashed backwards and flew through the suite door. It remained attached to its frame, so I slammed it shut. The moment my body had left the room, the noise was instantly extinguished. I leaped up and snatched the railing. Wasting no time looking back, I bounded down the hallway, nearly losing my grasp on the railing multiple times. Once I reached the raft, I discovered that the man was staring at me from the other side. He drifted up and down with the smooth waves. In his hands was a gray cube with a satellite dish attached to it. He leaned his head to the side and asked, "What caused that on your shoulder?" I bit my tongue, but hoped that my facial expression didn't betray it. I forced a smile. I had a misstep while descending. The man chuckled. "Afraid I can't help you there, friend. I fix men of metal, not men of carbon." I'm sure I'll figure something out. An unprompted image of the gruesome piles of bodies flashed across my mind. My tongue squirmed, but I decided I had to at least attempt to find out why they were there. I wish I had found something in that suite. A grim expression fell on the man's face. "What you saw in there wasn't decent, but it had to be done. I would have gone mad smelling all them and..." He trailed off. "Seeing those faces." Though it was a grim confession, I almost couldn't help but smile because of how easily the man had taken the bait. The man's fingers trembled across the cold, shiny metal of his box, and his arms froze at his side. I rushed to change the topic in case he did something drastic. "Anyway, what's that you've got?" I pointed to the metal box in his hands. The man's eyes darted from me to the box. Color washed over his face. "It's a mobile radio transmissioner. The only one in the whole ship that isn't shattered or a mile underwater. We gotta get home somehow." He lifted his finger to me and asked, "Who are you, anyhow? What you missing out on right about now?" I was nearly taken aback by his willingness to switch up the conversation, but I refused to be caught off guard. "I'm a biological researcher. Well, I was. I tested what kinds of life were edible and the benefits of eating it." "Sounds like an interesting career. I've already led on to my line of work. Thing is, me and you got a difference." I let out a half-hearted laugh. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you think we're gonna die out here. Listen to your words. They're hopeless. I'm promising you now that I'm gonna get us off-world and you can go back to your weird food researching. You really think you can pull that off?" The man's throat belched a deep laugh. "Can I? The real question is, how many days will it take? 1? 2? Heck, maybe I'll get lazy and we'll be here for 3. As good as you may be at whatever that is, what I'm really gonna need from you right now involves a whole lot of paddling," I said, staring at the faraway beach. The man shrugged. "I suppose you're right. We best get to work." The raft slipped onto the sand and beached itself. I gasped for air as I climbed out of the raft. The man hopped onto the beach with a smile on his face. "You sure did talk that process up. That took barely 20 minutes. "Yeah, whatever. So, what's your name, son?" "I'm Arnold. You?" "Daniel Rigatoni, at your service." Daniel gave a half-hearted bow. "Arnold, where exactly do you live?" I leaned backwards an inch. I didn't particularly want to bring Daniel back to my camp, but if it was true that he could get me off-world, it would have been worth it. I sighed before replying, "Come with me. It's not far." As we inched down the muddy slope and into the blades, I said, "Be careful walking around here. I've seen some nasty creatures." Daniel sighed. "I'm sure there's a way to deal with them. Animals are all machines, and in the end, A machine only does what it's programmed to do. Daniel began tinkering with the little box from the moment we arrived at camp. I told him to let me know if he needed my help, but I didn't actually expect him to do so, as I hadn't even recognized the device. Instead, I fetched my bandage roll and tied it around my shoulder. I was satisfied with my treatment, but the roll was left bare. I rubbed my hand across the previous spear-covered side of the first blade to receive my treatment. I smoothed out a few more and began to tie them together. My goal was to create a canteen, but I didn't intend to put water in it. I crouched down and grasped my hand around the stem of another blade when a fluffy mass passed across my fingers. I let go instantly and reflectively scooted backwards. A tiny brown lump dropped from the blade. I squinted my eyes and decided it must have been some kind of rodent. It was made up of a ball of hair with a black snout extending outside it. I could also see 3 little tan legs protruding from the hair as well. It skidded towards me and tapped its nose on my knee twice. It proceeded to push itself across my leg and sit down. It began to vibrate. "Are you purring?" I whispered. For a moment I lowered my head and remained motionless. I snapped back to the task at hand and slowly pushed the creature away. It hopped inches into the air and scurried into the blades. As I tore the blade the rodent-like creature had fallen from, I found numerous tiny holes in between the spears. "These are bite marks," I said aloud. "At least someone here is trying to eat something other than me." As the peculiarly small sun set, I used its fading light to gaze upon my creation. My canteen seemed a bit like a bowl, but I figured it would serve its purpose as well as appearing as if it could hold water. I tossed it into the capsule and turned to Daniel, who was still sitting in front of his cube. I opened my mouth, but he spoke first. "No luck today, I'm afraid. Don't worry about my betting. I'm not afraid of a little mud." I was tempted to question him, but I wasn't too keen on sharing my capsule. As I awoke the next morning, I slipped a bar of chocolate in my mouth and sat up. I sat on my bed for a good 30 minutes. I repeatedly doubted the effectiveness of my plan, but I knew there was no other choice. If I didn't pull it off, the corporation that owned the ship and my contractors would be after me. I had to fulfill my end of the bargain. I shoved the deflated emergency raft inside the blade canteen and tied off the top. As I carried it out of the capsule, Daniel's gaze followed me. I held the canteen as if nothing was in it, but as I nonchalantly swung it from side to side, it moved just slower than I had hoped. "Where are you going?" "Just getting some water. If you're right about us getting out of here in a couple days, I should only have to do this once." Daniel nodded and turned back to his cube. It made a faint whirring sound. I held the blade bag steady in my arms. I just needed to snatch them up and tie it closed. I laid my hand on the doorknob. "I already made my decision," I said aloud. "Surely they're too weak to fight back this time." I dashed through the door, bag held at my chest. I froze as my eyes sank to the ground. At my feet, piles of cartilage and bone washed over the floor. Ahead of me, on my old bed, a dozen slick blade shapes rested atop the sheets. At the head of the bed, a bumpy white mass dwelled on my pillow. I recognized the slick black shapes as the birds in a curled resting form. They had multiplied drastically in just a day. Standing absolutely motionless, I further inspected the white mass. They were eggs, I had no doubt. Their rigid oval shapes and the fact that a number of them were cracked open made it clear. I found an unexpected excitement from seeing them. It must have been a golden opportunity. I'd caught the birds sleeping with their eggs in plain sight. I crept inches closer. The bones grew denser and clattered ever so slightly louder. Balancing on the slanted floor, I passed the majority of the bed. They were in reach. I raised the canteen once again. A nearly inaudible crack hit my ears like a meteor. A black face peered through a brand new hole in one of the eggs. The tiny beast wailed and cried. A single bird stood. It shook its wings and turned gradually to the eggs. As it did so, it caught sight of me. An ear-shattering screech filled the room. Every single bird instantly raised their head and had soon taken flight. I ran through the door. This time its hinges were not so kind. With a crackle, the door flew into the hallway and began sliding down into the depths below. I attempted to snatch up the railing on the other end of the hall, but fell just short. I fell into a barrel roll. Doors passed at dark blurs. My face and limbs slammed into the floor repeatedly. I caught a glimpse of an oncoming room. I pushed downward with all my limbs and my head simultaneously. I launched myself into the door and managed to regain stability. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the pain from all of my body into my chest, and adrenaline took it from there. I shifted my head behind me and my stomach curled. A black mob of birds flew down the hall towards me. I attempted to twist the doorknob but found it to be locked. "Let me out!" I screamed. I bashed my knee into the door, but to no avail. I did the same with my elbow, and I felt the wood of the door shift backwards slightly. The screeching grew louder. I found myself slamming my forehead against the door. It finally came loose. I carried myself across an identical suite. I scanned the lake outside from the window. A shaky smile crawled across my face. I dashed back and forth through the room. Only 2 bodies lay in it. A glint caught my eye. I reached into the pocket of one of the bodies and grabbed a glinting silver key. I slammed it into a slit under the window and turned it. The window popped up slightly, allowing me to widen it just enough to fit through. The shrieks exploded from just outside the open doorframe. I slipped out the window in a straight-down position to minimize injury. The adrenaline pumping through my veins was so thick that by the time I hit the water, I couldn't feel a thing. Fortunately, I seemed to still be alive as my arms and legs egged me closer to the bright yellow raft. I vaulted onto it and collapsed on my back. My eyes drifted across the hulking wall of a ship in front of me. A single window 6 stories above the water lay half open. I raised my right arm and found it to be shaking violently. It didn't suggest I was in the best state, but I hadn't even noticed, so it was safe to say the adrenaline was still in my system. I took advantage of this realization by hand paddling the raft like my life depended on it, which, for all I knew, it very well may have. The raft barely touched the sand before I flung myself onto the shore. My wet hair and clothes sent droplets of water down my body. I curled my hands in the sand. I raised them and let the powder spill like tiny waterfalls between each of my fingers. I laid on that sand for what I perceived to be hours. At some point, I believed I had fallen asleep, but couldn't be entirely sure. I eventually stood as a cold thought faded across my mind. I would have to live with the enemies I had made. At least I had to attempt to continue living. Exactly how possible that was yet to be determined. Along with that, the story I told Daniel had completely fallen apart. My canteen was somewhere deeper than the ship. I rushed the nearby blades and tore them from the earth. I extracted a small stone from the mud and went to work. Minutes later, my mind grew chilled again as I said aloud, "How can I even leave? They'll find me!" I hurled my work down the hill. I dropped to my knees as rigid spikes of pain shredded my flesh. Every inch of my body screamed out for help. Due to the blunt nature of my injuries, I couldn't see more than a few dark patches and some torn skin. The adrenaline and the exhaustion were gone, leaving me with the consequences of my mistakes. The pain lessened within the hour, but never faded completely. I managed to make a somewhat convincing recreation of my canteen and filled it with water. I popped a plastic white plug out of the raft. A whoosh of air flew through the hole left by the plug. After the raft had deflated, I folded it neatly and brought it to the blades. I placed it in the shrubbery, careful not to cut it open by the blade spears. My eyes caught a familiar sight to the left. I turned to see my makeshift dagger still resting on the mud. I picked it up and found it to be surprisingly well maintained. Its form had degraded slightly, as the blade it was made of shriveled, but it appeared to still be in serviceable condition. I dropped it back into the mud. You can't save me from them. I don't think any weapon could. The journey back from the hill took only 15 minutes. Halfway there, I found a skull. Not of an animal, but of a man. It was pure white, with little splotches of red and brown. Additionally, it was on top of the mud. I scanned the surrounding area to discover numerous other bones. Most were barely visible as they laid much deeper into the blades. All of them bore tiny marks of blood. Who's this? Did the birds do this? Did the cat? My eyes darted back and forth. Is this who escaped in my capsule? Is this him? I grunted and began a slow walk away from the unceremonial grave. I would never get to learn who that was. That was a privilege redeemed only by the murderer. Daniel rubbed his hands anxiously as I placed the full canteen at his side. Took you long enough, Arnold. If you want us to get out of here, I can't be dehydrated. Yeah, sorry about that. I thought I'd take a swim to get my mind off things. Daniel chuckled. You better not be polluting my drinking water, young man. He laughed. Of course, I'm sure plenty of other things are already clocked in doing just that. No time to filter it, though. We gotta get out of here. He turned half back towards his machine cube. Speaking of which, I've made some progress. I got in contact with the ship's company, and now we're trying to map out our coordinates. I scraped my teeth together, but managed to say, That's good. How are you gonna get the coordinates? Daniel sighed. There's a tracking device in each of these escape capsules that they can use to find us. Unfortunately, in the little bit of their messages I've been able to make out, it sounds like there's a whole lot more of these capsules laying around. Some launched early and are hundreds of miles away. I expected a sweet tinge of relief, but I found myself empty. I had to be evacuated off of the planet sooner or later. Whether I stayed or was picked up, I figured I was in for a firestorm. 2 days passed in near silence. Daniel did little other than sit in front of his cube. Clearly, he never planned on taking my warning about the wildlife seriously. I almost never heard him say anything, but we're so close. We're so close. I've made big progress today, and we're almost out of here. I just need a teensy bit more time. At the dawn of the 3rd day, I woke before the sun had risen. I had water and food. My pain had grown marginally more manageable. I had no idea what could have woken me up other than worry. I accepted this to be the case, but before I could drift back into slumber, I caught a faint murmur coming from outside the capsule. I pushed against the tired weight in my chest and sat up. The murmur continued. I peeked at the outside world and found 2 dark figures standing across from each other. I instantly recognized the short, plump body of Daniel as one of the figures. I squinted my eyes at the other, desperately attempting to make out its face. It moved with erratic gestures and motions. Unfortunately, my attempt to identify it was successful. My stomach churned and my hands trembled. Not only had he found me, but he had found my companion. I have to get out of here, I whispered to myself. I creeped out of the capsule. My worn shoes pushed holes in the mud below them. I slid around the edge of the capsule, so I wasn't in his line of sight. I snuck across the bladeless yard with the trail to the hill in sight. I only had to get into the blades, which would cover me from all sides. At the head of the trail, I rotated my head to take one last look at the camp. Both the figures stood at the entrance to the capsule. The taller of the 2 spun his head around and locked onto me. I stood up straight and sprinted into the darkness. The shadows of the blades blurred across my peripheral vision. Shouting followed me. Before I knew it, I had reached the hill. My foot slid across the mud and I landed on my elbows. I regained my balance and started forward again. The yelling had grown in volume. As I reached the top of the hill, I froze. Ahead of me was a vast lake, and to my sides were nothing but thick blades. I'm gonna kill you. My head snapped around to see the figure sprinting up the hill. My legs grew heavy atop my feet. I wondered what he intended to do. Did he think he was gonna punch me to death? Would he try to drown me in the lake? I spent no more than a second glancing at the bare fists of the approaching man. I dashed through the thick line of the blades. I threw my arms into them haphazardly. Pain rippled through them, but I grunted and persisted. As I extracted my arms, blood glinted across them in the moonlight. I paid no attention, however, because in my hands was the dagger. I turned towards the man and anchored my feet to the ground. I concealed the dagger behind me. I don't want to kill you. The man was tall and bore long blonde hair. He wore a tattered blue uniform covered in pockets. He reached the hill's plateau and stopped. He leaned his head to the side and said, So now you draw the line? Fists are too cruel, but countless bullets, lodged in countless heads, are fine? He took a step closer. You run like a pigeon flies. The moment our capsule landed, you were gone. I should have killed you when I had the chance. He closed his eyes and smirked. I'm not afraid of our primal ways anymore. These past few days have made me sure of it.
I've slaughtered and eaten beasts with my hands. I leaped forward, slashing the dagger's spears across the man's neck. A dozen lines of red slid across it. The man fell to his knees, clutching his throat. He shook rapidly for a moment, but suddenly became still. He squeezed his neck tight and glared up at me. He attempted to speak, but nothing but a distorted groan escaped the slits in his throat. He stared firmly at me with unwavering eyes until the moment he fell. Half of his face was buried in the mud. The other half displayed a still open eyeball staring upward. I had won. I had finally cut my loose end. No, 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 no! I screamed into the night. The man had spoken to Daniel. I rummaged through my memories to find anything and everything the man could have told him. It was too much. Even just a few sentences would have been too much. A thin shadow blocked the moon for a fraction of a second. I covered my mouth. I crouched and waited in silence. In my head I thought, but I have to leave. I can't stay here. I scanned the blades around me. It was an ecosystem that held no place for me. I was an intruder among the beasts of the valley. I knew I needed to join Daniel in our escape, but what if he had become the man? I never feared the man for his capabilities, only for his knowledge, something which can be transferred. I slowly stood up straight. I took a step down the hill, then another. I had to go back. If there was any chance of escape, it was better than none. The world of man may have wanted me dead, but at least I knew what to expect. Something scurried through the blades. In that valley, I knew nothing. The dagger grew flimsy, but its spears remained firm. If I had to, I could kill again. I had grown rather used to it. "You came back?" asked Daniel, taking a step away from me. His face was drained of color and his mouth hung open when he wasn't speaking. I cleared my throat. Are we going home? Daniel's accent died and was replaced with a gruff but rigid voice as he said, "My entire crew was on that ship. They were family to me." My mouth opened, but before I'd decided what to say, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. You can't plan for that kind of chaos. You were gonna hijack the ship. I don't know what you thought you were gonna do with it, but I'm having a hard time believing everyone on board was gonna get a pass if you succeeded." I grunted and refused to heed his words. He had just lost loved ones. He couldn't possibly understand in such a state. "Daniel, we will leave this planet and you won't tell a soul who I am." I raised the bloody dagger into his sight. "I didn't want to do it to him, and I don't want to do it to you." Daniel reached behind his belt and withdrew an inky black handgun. He lifted it to my face. My knees locked and my muscles clenched. "Please, surely you believe I've changed now that I've seen the damage. I've seen the bodies." Daniel flipped his gun back and forth as if he could easily kill me without it. "You had one of these. At least that's what he told me. He said you killed dozens, didn't even miss a shot. Someone so capable must have experience. You don't go from a pacifist to a murderer with a fair chance of hijacking one of the largest vessels in the sky overnight." "I can tell them who hired me. I can be a double agent." Daniel stopped fidgeting with the gun and held it steady. The black barrel aimed down my vision. Maybe that'd work. Maybe they'd agree, but I gained nothing from this deal. I accepted the death of my closest friends as a blameless accident. Now that someone has claimed blame, I intend to enact revenge. So many more could have died. The crash was nothing compared to what they would have done. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but did not loosen the grip on his gun. I took a deep breath and explained. "They wanted me to get the ship for them, but that was only a side objective. The main cargo was a pair of Sleeviks." I gradually stepped forward, holding my dagger steady. "Sleeviks? The extinction birds? We use those to empty continents. Were they for people?" I nodded my head. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut and visibly clenched his teeth. I dashed forward. The mud below me squealed as I stepped off of it. An ear-shattering bang exploded around me for a millisecond. My back was wet. Every muscle in my body perpetually tensed themselves. I felt something emanate from my stomach. I took a sudden breath and opened my eyes. Daniel stood above me. A thin line of smoke rose from the barrel of his gun. He locked eyes with me, his finger wrapped around the trigger. You would have allowed for the death of millions! I told my arms to flail wildly, but I couldn't even raise them from the ground. Daniel closed his eyes and lowered the gun. Its metal clapped against the mud. I wish I had a fraction of your wretched, apathetic soul, just so I could do what I know I should. A whoosh of air blasted my face. Daniel was gone. I heard flapping from above. His shoulders were gripped tightly between the talons of the massive bird. His legs flew up and down but remained firmly attached to the rest of his doomed body. A splotch of blood landed on the mud next to me. It met a thin stream of my own blood. I stared up at Daniel. Without him, I knew I'd be free. He was the last one who knew who I really was. Despite that, I managed to lob my arm into the air. I reached for him as if I could pull him back down to earth. I guess it's just one more life, I said to the darkness of the night. As my eyes began to lose Daniel's form, they suddenly widened to regain focus. A shiny black sphere engulfed both Daniel and his captor. Their rapid incline in height came to a screeching halt. Out of the black sphere, tiny white specks began to fall to the ground. A skull smashed against the capsule. A jagged piece of white shrapnel lodged itself into my foot. I held back a scream. The black sphere grew larger as it approached. Far above the sphere, a glint of red lit up the sky for a moment. A gray rectangle sped down from the heavens. It flew past the sphere and stopped just above the ground. 4 steel legs extended from its base as it touched down. One of its walls slid open, and 4 men stepped out.
Sir, are you hurt?
The sphere was finally close enough that with one glance I understood exactly what it was. It was made from a mass of Slivex. Their beaked faces extended from outside the mass with red eyes of fury. They darted into the landed ship. I rolled over and pushed myself across the mud with my elbows. 4 piles of bones lay at the base of the ship. My chest screamed out, but I didn't make a peep. A roar came from behind me. I rotated my head to see the bulky tiger-like creature explode from the blades. Slivex hung onto it from all angles. Their talons entrenched into the cat, while their beaks pecked away at it with brutal strength and precision. The cat let out a pained moan, and one of its legs gave out from under it. The rest of its body soon followed suit, leaving it writhing on the ground. I extracted every remaining ounce of strength in my body and pulled myself into the capsule. Blood pooled on the steel floor. Squeals echoed through the capsule. I imagined the fluffy rodent enveloped by the mass of Slivex. I wondered, was it him? Was it something I had never seen? A tear slid down my cheek. I couldn't seem to understand why I cared. I had a bullet in my chest and a bone shrapnel in my leg. I had caused the deaths of more people than I could possibly comprehend, and yet only then did I care. I rubbed my head, feeling for any abnormalities. I discovered nothing. I felt as if an eternity had passed before the light of the sun shone into my eyes. I reached for a candy bar and managed to tear its wrapper. My teeth struggled to bite into the chocolate. I grunted as I lifted my head and pulled myself towards the capsule's entrance. Multiple piles of unidentifiable bones lay across the glistening mud. The ship remained open. I attempted to pull myself out of the capsule, but my leg wouldn't budge. I felt my remaining strength dwindle as I moved mere inches. Dried mud covered my shirt. It crackled and fractured as I pulled the shirt up to my shoulders. A hole punctured right through my chest. It was covered in red, but the bleeding seemed to have stopped. Additionally, green lines shone from underneath my skin next to the wound. I closed my eyes and laid my head on the floor. As I drifted into a pained rest, I heard faint screeches from somewhere far away. The sun rested exactly where it had when I drifted off. Both hunger and thirst ravaged my body. My limbs were as heavy as steel as I lifted my shirt again. My entire chest had been engulfed in thin green lines. They shot ripples of pain through my nerves. I gripped the capsule's entrance and pulled my mountain of a body towards it. A flat expanse of brown extended in front of me. It was littered with white specks and red splotches. I had nothing but mud and bones for comfort. Even the stems of the blades were barely visible. They protruded out of the mud just enough to show a tiny speck of green. Far above, clouds of black swirled back and forth, the sun glinting across their entire lengths. Thousands of Sleeviks touched down and gripped the slick ground with their talons. I couldn't force myself to pull my eyes away. I thought it came from intrigue or some twisted sense of curiosity. Even when I convinced myself to look away and search for food and water, I remained still. I told my eyelids to move and pushed them hard. My eyes didn't close. I lifted my arms to do it forcibly, but neither arm even rose from the capsule's floor. The air drifting through my nose slowed. Most barely made it through my nostrils. My eyes were fixed on a single Sleevix as it approached. The Sleevix stared back as its little talons sliced through the mud. Faint shades of green faded into my peripheral vision. They grew darker and more defined. The Sleevix squawked and took off. With a whoosh, it flew far above my vision in an instant. I was left gazing at nothing but the mud.